He ruled an empire built on fear, blood, and absolute control. No rival had ever made Rafael Viscari flinch. No enemy had ever made him run. But on one ordinary Tuesday morning, the most dangerous man on the East Coast stood alone in his own bedroom, holding a single envelope, and felt something crack wide open inside his chest. His wife was gone. Not dead. Not taken. Gone. By choice. Completely and silently, she had erased herself from his life while he slept beside another woman.
If you've ever loved someone and lost them to your own arrogance, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The drive home from Celeste's apartment always took 40 minutes. Rafael Viscari knew that stretch of road the way a man knows his own pulse. The long curve past the industrial waterfront, the amber streetlights bleeding orange across the wet asphalt, the single traffic light at Morin Avenue that caught him every time without fail. He had made this drive hundreds of times over the past 3 years. Sometimes in the deep ink of midnight, sometimes at 3 in the morning when Celeste had fallen asleep against his shoulder and the apartment felt too small for everything he was carrying. Tonight, or rather this morning, it was already 4:15. He drove with the windows cracked and the radio off, letting the cold March air fill the cabin of the black Escalade. Marco drove. Marco always drove. The man hadn't spoken an unsolicited word in 11 years of employment, which was precisely why Rafael trusted him above almost every other person in his organization. Trust, in Rafael's world, was measured in silence. The less a man spoke, the less he could eventually be made to repeat. Rafael sat in the back seat with one arm resting against the door, watching the city scroll past. His jacket was open. His shirt collar was loose. He smelled faintly of Celeste's perfume, something expensive she'd started wearing because she'd once overheard him say he liked it. And beneath that, the ghost of the scotch they'd shared around midnight. He felt settled in the particular way a man feels settled when he believes every variable in his life is accounted for. His empire was running cleanly. 2 new shipping contracts through the Port Authority had opened fresh channels he'd been engineering for 18 months. His lieutenant, a sharp, unreadable man named Doyle, had quietly neutralized a competing interest in the Southern Corridor without any collateral that could attract attention. The legal side of Rafael's holdings, the hospitality group, the real estate development arm, the private security consulting firm, was performing well enough to satisfy accountants who asked no inconvenient questions. And Celeste, warm and vivid and uncomplicated, had kissed him at the door, with both palms flat against his chest, and told him she loved him. He had said, "I know." Not cruelly, not deliberately. It had simply come out that way, and he hadn't corrected it, and she had smiled anyway because she had learned to receive whatever version of affection he was capable of offering on any given night. The gate to the estate rolled open as the Escalade approached. Sensors, not staff. Rafael had updated the entry system 2 years ago because he preferred the gate to open before headlights could be spotted from inside the house. Old habit. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where arriving home late meant accounting for your whereabouts to someone, and he'd spent his entire adult life engineering situations where he never had to explain himself to anyone. Marco pulled the car around the circular drive and stopped at the front entrance without being asked. Rafael opened his own door. Another old habit. He disliked being helped in and out of vehicles. It felt theatrical. He stepped out, buttoned one button on his jacket against the cold, and looked up at the house. Every window was dark. That was normal. It was 4 in the morning. Serena had never waited up for him. Not anymore. Not for years. In the early days of their marriage, she had, sometimes falling asleep on the living room couch with a book collapsed open on her chest, and he had stood in the doorway watching her sleep and felt something he had never been able to name clearly. That had stopped. He couldn't remember exactly when. These things stop gradually, and gradual things are easy to miss when a man is busy constructing the architecture of his own importance. He let himself in through the front door. The alarm panel beeped its 2-tone recognition when he pressed his thumb to the reader. The foyer lights were on their overnight setting, low, amber, just enough to navigate by. The house smelled like nothing. He stopped. The house always smelled like something. Serena burned reed diffusers in the hallway. She had a preference for cedar and something floral that he had never bothered to identify by name, only registered as background noise, the same way a man registers the hum of a refrigerator he's lived beside for years. The smell was simply part of the house. It was simply part of home. It wasn't there. Raphael stood in the foyer for 3 full seconds, which was not something he did. He was not a man who paused in doorways. He moved through spaces with the deliberate momentum of someone who understood that stillness invites scrutiny. But something in the air, or the absence of something in the air, made him stand there with his hand still on the interior door handle, breathing slowly, processing. He walked toward the kitchen. The hallway between the foyer and the kitchen passed the formal sitting room on the left and a small study on the right. Raphael glanced into the sitting room as he passed. The furniture was there. The lamps. The large oil painting above the mantel that Serena had selected from a gallery in the West Village 8 years ago. A landscape, muted greens and grays, which he had privately thought was depressing, but had never said so because she had looked at it with the specific expression she reserved for things she found genuinely beautiful. The painting was still there. The framed family photographs on the side table beside the sofa were not. Raphael stopped walking. He stood in the hallway and looked at the side table. The table itself was there, a narrow antique piece with curved legs that Serena had refinished herself the first year they'd lived in this house. But the surface was bare. No photographs. No small decorative bowl she kept there for her keys and occasional loose change. Just wood. Just empty, clean, polished wood that caught the low hallway light and gave it back as a dull reflection. He walked into the kitchen. The envelope was on the counter. It was a standard legal-sized envelope, cream-colored, unsealed. His name was written on the front in Serena's handwriting. Not her careful public handwriting, the controlled, elegant script she used for charity correspondence and formal notes. Her real handwriting. The slightly forward-leaning, compact hand she used for grocery lists and private reminders. The version of her writing that existed only in the unobserved margins of their shared life. He stood at the counter for a long moment before he picked it up. The papers inside were clean, precise, and fully executed. Dissolution of marriage. Every line filled out correctly. Every required signature present. The attorney's name on the letterhead was one Raphael did not recognize, which meant Serena had specifically chosen someone outside the network of lawyers whose loyalty his money had secured over the years. The filing date on the documents was 3 days ago. She had already filed. She had already begun the legal process, completed her side of it entirely, and left him his copies. Raphael set the papers on the counter. He picked them back up. He read them again, every line, though there was nothing in them that required a second reading. They were unambiguous. They were complete. They were, as far as legal documents went, almost elegant in their economy. No lengthy accusations, no financial disputes itemized across pages, no demands for discovery or forensic accounting. Serena had taken what the law entitled her to and had not reached for a single inch beyond that. He set the papers down a second time and stood very still, his hands flat on the cool granite, and breathed. Marco was still outside in the car. He would wait until told otherwise. Raphael walked upstairs. The master bedroom door was open, which it always was. Serena had a slight aversion to closed interior doors, something she'd mentioned exactly once in 12 years of marriage, and he had filed it away without examining why she felt that way, and without ever asking. The bed was made. Precisely made. The way the housekeeper made it on Mondays, with the decorative pillows arranged and the duvet pulled smooth and geometric. The nightstands on both sides were present, the lamps present, the small frame mirror on the dresser present. But the dresser surface was bare, no jewelry dish, no collection of small, meaningful objects, the worn leather cuff her late mother had given her, the tiny brass compass she'd carried since her 20s, the photograph in the plain silver frame of herself and her 2 oldest friends taken somewhere cold and bright, both women laughing at something happening just outside the frame. He opened the closet. Serena's side was empty. Not disheveled, not hurriedly cleared. Empty in the way a room is empty after a professional moving team has been through it with systematic care. Every hanger equidistant, those remaining belonging to him, everything of hers absent without leaving the impression of absence. No gap where a particular coat used to hang, no lonely single shoe forgotten on the rack. Whatever she had taken with a thoroughness that communicated intention. She had not packed in anger.
She had packed the way someone packs when they have been planning the packing for a very long time. Raphael sat on the edge of the bed. He sat there in his open jacket and his loosened collar and his faint traces of another woman's perfume, and he looked at the place on the dresser where the small brass compass used to sit, and he thought nothing for a moment. His mind, which was a precision instrument he had spent decades sharpening, went briefly quiet. Then it started working. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and called Serena's number. The line rang twice and then connected, not to voicemail, not to the recorded greeting he would have expected, but to a carrier notification. The number had been disconnected. She had canceled the line. The phone she carried had belonged to a plan registered in his name, because everything in their life together had existed within the infrastructure he controlled, and she had walked out of that infrastructure entirely, including the phone. He called again. Same notification. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and made himself think carefully, because careful thinking was the only tool he had ever trusted absolutely. She had an attorney he didn't know. She had a phone she had either already canceled or transferred to a private account. She had moved personal belongings, gradually, because nothing in the house looked ransacked or suddenly diminished, which meant this had been happening over time, incrementally, invisibly, right in front of everyone who worked in this house. His security staff, his housekeeper, his people who reported to him, who watched the property, who believed their job was to protect this house from external threat. None of them had noticed. Or they had noticed and said nothing, which was a different problem entirely. He stood up and walked back downstairs, picking up the divorce papers from the kitchen counter on his way to his private study at the rear of the house. He sat behind his desk, set the papers in front of him under the desk lamp, and stared at the attorney's name on the letterhead. Callaway, Senna, and Marsh. He had never heard of this firm. He typed the name into his phone and found a small, clean, low-profile family law practice in a city 60 miles north. No corporate clients. No visible connections to anyone in his world. She had done her research. He set the phone face down on the desk. The study clock said 4:52. Outside, the first gray suggestion of morning was beginning to appear at the bottom of the sky beyond the window. Raphael had watched countless sunrises from this window. It faced east, which was why he had chosen this room. But he had never watched one feeling the way he felt now. It was not grief, exactly. It wasn't the hot, reactive shock of hearing that someone had died. It was something colder, something that lived in the stomach rather than the chest, something that came with the particular weight of realizing a thing has already happened and cannot be unhappened, the way you discover you've been locked out of a building only after the door has closed behind you. He had been so certain she was simply there, the way he was certain of the gate sensor, certain of the amber foyer lights on their overnight setting, certain of Marco waiting in the car without being told. Serena had become, somewhere in the architecture of his daily assumptions, an object of certainty. Not a person he attended to, but a fixed condition of his environment, reliable and stable and therefore invisible in the way that reliable, stable things become invisible. He had not seen her leave because he had stopped looking at her years ago. He picked up his phone and called Doyle. Doyle answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been asleep, which meant something else was already happening tonight that Raphael didn't yet know about. That was a separate problem. He filed it away. "I need Serena found," Raphael said, quietly. "Nothing that looks like pressure. I want to know where she is. Not contact. Location. You understand the distinction." Doyle was quiet for a half-second in the particular way Doyle was quiet when he was processing something unexpected. "Yeah," he said. "I understand. Her attorney is a firm called Callaway, Senna, and Marsh, 60 miles north. Start there." "Tonight?" "Now." He ended the call. He sat in the study as the gray morning pressed itself against the window glass and thought about the last time he and Serena had spoken. Genuinely spoken, not exchanged functional information across a dinner table or navigated a shared social obligation at one of her charity events. He couldn't place it. He could remember the most recent exchange, 3 nights ago, he thought, when she had mentioned something about a leaking fixture in the guest bathroom, and he had said he'd have it looked at, but he couldn't remember the last time they had spoken in a way that had weight, in a way where both of them were fully present in the same conversation. He couldn't find that memory. He searched for it with the same systematic precision he applied to everything, working backward through months, and came up empty.
It was this, more than the empty closet, more than the disconnected phone, more than the clean cream envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. This was the thing that settled into his chest like cold water. He didn't know when she had stopped being a person he talked to and started being a person he lived beside. And she apparently had known exactly when. Around 6 in the morning, the housekeeper arrived. Elena, a small, composed woman who had worked in the house for 9 years. Raphael heard the service entrance, heard the familiar sounds of a routine morning beginning, and waited. Elena appeared in the study doorway 4 minutes later, saw him at the desk, and said nothing for a moment because his presence at the desk at 6 in the morning was itself information.
Mrs. Viscari, Raphael said before Elena could offer a greeting. When did she start moving her things out? Elena looked at him. Her face was a careful thing, professionally arranged, and he could see her decide in real time how to answer. That decision, the small, visible moment of calculation, told him everything about what Elena already knew and had not said. Mr. Vescari, she said, I believe she had been moving smaller items for some time, several weeks at least.
Months.
Elena's hands, held together in front of her at the apron, tightened almost imperceptibly. I think possibly months, sir. Raphael nodded slowly. You didn't say anything? No, sir.
He didn't press it. He understood Elena's position with a cold, clear-eyed pragmatism. The woman had a son in college. She had been loyal to this house for 9 years, which in his world was long enough to know that loyalty sometimes required knowing exactly which pieces of information were safe to carry and which were not. She had made a calculation. He didn't blame her. He would have made the same calculation. Thank you, Elena, he said. She withdrew. He sat alone in the study as the house filled slowly with ordinary morning sounds. The coffee machine in the kitchen, the muffled movement of domestic routine, and tried to locate, within the precise inventory of his own behavior over the past several years, the moment he had lost Serena without knowing he was losing her. What he found instead was evidence of how little he had been paying attention. The anniversary dinner 2 years ago that he had pushed back to the following week because of a meeting, and then forgotten to reschedule. The time she had called 3 times during a single afternoon, and he had silenced the calls because he was with Celeste, and silencing the calls had felt practical rather than cruel. The charity gala where she had stood beside him in a green dress that he had not commented on, though she had clearly chosen it with care, and he had spent the evening managing a conversation with a city councilman whose cooperation he was in the process of acquiring. He had believed, without ever consciously articulating the belief, that Serena's steadiness meant contentment, that a woman who did not complain had nothing to complain about, that a woman who continued to fulfill the social obligations of his life, the dinners, the galas, the public appearances, the careful management of their household's visible image, was a woman who had accepted the terms of their arrangement. He had mistaken endurance for peace. He had mistaken silence for agreement. And by the time he understood the difference, she was already gone, not from the house, but from any authentic connection to the life they shared. And she had been gone for long enough that leaving the house itself was simply the final, administrative step in a departure that had been completed long before she packed the first box. Doyle called back at 8:47. His voice, when Raphael answered, had a careful quality to it. The quality of a man delivering news to someone he respects enough not to soften it artificially. She's in the city, Doyle said, staying with a friend. Someone from before. College, I think. Off the radar. Nothing registered to your name or your accounts. She has a new phone, new number, registered private. The attorney filed the papers 3 days ago. Everything's above board. She hasn't spoken to anyone in our network. Is she safe? Raphael said. He was surprised to hear himself ask it. He hadn't planned to ask it. There was a brief silence on Doyle's end. She's fine, Doyle said. She looks, from what I can tell, she looks okay. Raphael said nothing. You want me to arrange contact? Doyle asked. No, Raphael said. He ended the call, set the phone on the desk, and looked at the divorce papers sitting beneath the lamp. Outside the window, the morning had fully arrived. Gray and wet, a thin March rain beginning to trace lines down the glass. The city beyond the estate walls was awake and moving, indifferent, functioning perfectly without any input from him. In 12 years of marriage, he had never once asked himself whether Serena was happy. He had asked himself whether she was provided for.
whether she was protected, whether she had everything she required. He had answered yes to all of those questions and filed the matter as resolved. He had never once asked whether she was happy. The divorce papers lay on the desk. Outside, the rain fell. Inside the house, Elena moved through her morning routines, and the coffee machine finished its cycle, and the gate sensor registered Marco arriving for the day shift, and the vast, expensive, immaculate machinery of Rafael Vescari's life continued operating with its usual precision. He sat alone at his desk, and for the first time in 30 years of building something he believed could not be touched, Rafael Vescari felt the specific hollow weight of a man who had won everything he'd aimed for and lost the one thing he'd never thought to protect. He picked up the divorce papers again. On the second page in the section reserved for additional notes, there was a single line in Serena's compact, forward-leaning handwriting. He had missed it the first time. Or he had seen it and his mind had moved past it, the way his mind had moved past so many things. It read, "I didn't leave angry. I left free." Raphael set the papers down. He stared at the rain on the window. And somewhere across the city, in an apartment he didn't know the address of, Serena Aldridge was waking up to the first morning of the rest of her life. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she was not waiting for anything. The rain didn't stop. It kept falling through the morning and into the afternoon. The kind of slow, patient rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but simply arrives and stays, pressing down on the city like a hand on a shoulder. Raphael sat in his study until 9, then moved to the kitchen, where Elena had left coffee on the counter and said nothing when he came in. He poured a cup he didn't drink and stood at the window above the sink, watching the water move across the surface of the stone patio outside. The divorce papers were still on the desk in the study. He had not moved them. He had not called his own attorney yet, which was unusual. Raphael's instinct in any situation involving legal exposure was to have counsel on the phone within the hour. He had built his organization on the principle that the man who responds first controls the terms of the response. But he had not called. He had stood at the window with cold coffee and watched the rain and thought about the single line Serena had written in her compact handwriting at the bottom of the second page. "I didn't leave angry. I left free." There was something in those 7 words that he kept returning to, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. Not the sentiment. He understood the sentiment with a clarity that was almost clinical. What he couldn't stop examining was the tone. There was no performance in those words, no calculated wound, no final salvo designed to travel with him. She hadn't written it to hurt him. She had written it because it was true, and because she was the kind of person who, even at the end of 12 years and whatever had happened inside them, couldn't quite bring herself to leave without leaving something honest behind. That was the thing about Serena. She had always been honest in a way that made dishonesty feel exhausting by comparison. He put the coffee cup in the sink and went to find Doyle. Doyle was in the security office at the east end of the first floor, a windowless room with a bank of monitors showing the gate, the perimeter, the driveway, and 6 other angles of the property. He was sitting at the desk with a tablet in his hand and a half-eaten sandwich beside him that he had apparently lost interest in. He looked up when Raphael came in and set the tablet face down on the desk in a single, automatic motion. Not because he was hiding anything, because he had worked for Raphael long enough that face down was simply the default position for anything that wasn't being actively reviewed. "Tell me everything you know about who helped her," Raphael said. He didn't sit. He leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed and his eyes on Doyle's face. Doyle didn't hesitate. "From what I can put together, she moved things herself, small items, over a long period. I don't think she used movers for the personal stuff. The larger furniture is still here, which means she wasn't relocating a household. She was extracting herself. Who helped her find the attorney? Don't know yet. The apartment she's staying in, whose name is it registered to? A woman named Patricia Voss grew up with Serena. They went to Hartwell College together. Voss is a clinical social worker now, lives in the Meridian district. Nothing in our network connects to her. Clean." Raphael absorbed this. Serena never mentioned her. She mentioned her twice, Doyle said. In 2019, at the Hargrove Foundation dinner, she told the woman beside her that she'd gone to school with someone named Patty, who was doing meaningful work in family services. "You were talking to Hargrove at the time." A pause. "I was standing nearby." Raphael looked at him. "You remembered that." "I remember things," Doyle said with no particular emphasis.
It's what you pay me for. The implication settled in the room quietly. That Doyle had been paying attention to Serena in contexts where Raphael had not, and that this was not a commentary but simply a fact, delivered without judgment because Doyle was professionally incapable of performing emotions he didn't feel. She has resources, Raphael said, her own accounts. She didn't touch our joint assets.
No, nothing. She's been building a separate financial picture for, I'd estimate, 8 to 10 months, based on the account activity I can trace. Small deposits into a private savings account that she opened under her maiden name, Aldridge, not Viscari. The bank is in a city 40 miles north of here. She never used an ATM near the house.
Raphael pushed off the doorframe and walked to the far end of the small room, then back. Not pacing. He didn't pace. He considered it a visible vulnerability, but moving, because standing still was no longer possible. She planned this for almost a year, at minimum. And no one in this house said anything. Doyle looked at him steadily. No one in this house felt it was their position to say anything. That's a distinction without a difference. With respect, Doyle said, it's not. He let that sit for a moment before continuing. The people in this house work for you, Raphael, not for the marriage. There's a difference in what they feel obligated to report. It was the first time Doyle had used his name rather than a title in longer than Raphael could immediately remember, and the familiarity of it, the slight careful intimacy of it, registered as a form of candor that Doyle extended rarely and only when he had decided that precision mattered more than protocol. Raphael stopped moving. Are you telling me you knew? I'm telling you I noticed things I didn't know how to categorize, Doyle said. She was quieter in the last year. She stopped arguing with the catering staff about event details. She used to care a lot about those details. She stopped asking about your schedule. A pause. When someone stops asking about your schedule, it means they've stopped organizing their life around yours. The room was very quiet. Outside in the hallway, somewhere distant in the house, Elena was running water. Why are you telling me this now? Raphael said. Because you asked, Doyle said, and because you're about to make decisions about what happens next, and I think you should make them with accurate information. Raphael looked at the bank of monitors for a long moment. The gate, the perimeter, the empty driveway. All clear. All secure. The property perfectly defended against every threat that had ever materialized, and completely vulnerable to the one that had been operating from the inside for 8 months without triggering a single alarm. Find out if she needs anything, Raphael said. Doyle's expression shifted by approximately nothing, but the quality of his attention changed. You want me to make contact. I want you to determine whether she's physically safe and financially stable. Without contact, without pressure. Can you do that without contact? I can try. Don't try. Do it in a way that's invisible. He left the security office and went upstairs to change because he still smelled like Celeste's apartment, and the combination of that smell and this morning was something he could no longer tolerate. He did not call Celeste. She called him at 11:43 as he was coming back down the stairs in clean clothes with his hair still damp from the shower. He looked at her name on the screen for one full ring before answering. You left early, she said. Her voice had that particular quality it got in the morning. Lower, more private, stripped of the social performance she applied in public. He had once found this version of her voice appealing. This morning it landed differently, like music playing in the wrong room. Something came up, he said. Something always comes up. Not accusatory, just observational. Celeste had learned, across 3 years, to make observations rather than accusations, because observations were things he might engage with, whereas accusations were things he immediately classified as threats to be managed. I know, he said. He was standing in the hallway, one hand in his jacket pocket, not moving toward any particular room. Are you okay? He almost said yes. The word was right there, automatic, the answer he gave to every question about his internal state, because the alternative was a conversation he didn't know how to have. But something this morning, the empty closet, the cream envelope, the 7 words in Serena's handwriting, had loosened something in the machinery of his reflexes, and the automatic answer didn't come. I don't know, he said instead. Silence on her end. He'd surprised her. In 3 years, he had never said those words in that order. What happened? She said. Serena left. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. He could hear Celeste breathing on the other end of the line, a slow, careful breath, the kind you take when you need a moment to process something significant without letting the person on the other end hear you processing it. Left, she said. Filed divorce papers, moved out, the house is... He paused, looking down the hallway toward the kitchen. She's gone. Another breath. Then, Raphael. She said his name the way women say names when they are feeling something large and trying to decide how large to let it be in front of the person who caused it. Are you... I'm fine, he said, the automatic answer returning to cover the ground the previous honest answer had briefly exposed. I just wanted you to know. Why? He didn't have a clean answer to that. I don't know, he said again, and it was the truth for the second time in 3 minutes, which might have been a record. Do you want to come over? Celeste asked. No. Do you want me to come there? No. She was quiet for a moment. Then why are you calling me? You called me, he said. Right. Another beat. Raphael, I need you to... She stopped, started again. This is the part where I'm supposed to be happy, isn't it? She's gone. The door's open, and I'm standing here trying to figure out if you called to tell me good news or bad news, and I honestly can't tell. He didn't say anything. That's the answer, Celeste said very quietly. Isn't it? He couldn't give her anything useful, so he gave her honesty, which was not the same as kindness, but was sometimes the only thing left. I don't know what I'm feeling right now. I don't think I should be around anyone until I do. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a cry, but lived in the narrow space between those two things. Okay, she said. Okay, call me when you know. She ended the call. He stood in the hallway for a moment longer, then walked to the kitchen and picked up the divorce papers from the counter where he'd left them after bringing them down from the study. He read through them again, slowly, methodically, the way he read contracts, looking for leverage, for gaps, for the specific pressure points where a document's logic could be shifted. He found nothing of that kind. The papers were clean. They asked for what they asked for, which was almost nothing, and they offered what they offered, which was complete dissolution with minimal dispute. He set them down on the kitchen table, not the counter this time, but the table. He sat down across from them. The kitchen table was a large farmhouse piece that Serena had found at an estate sale in their 3rd year together. She'd driven 2 hours to look at it, returned without it, spent 4 days reconsidering, and then driven 2 hours back to buy it. He had never understood the 4 days of reconsidering. It was a table. It was either right or it wasn't. But she had explained, with patient good humor, that some things needed to be considered from a distance to know whether you actually wanted them or just liked how they looked in the moment. He had thought that was an excessive amount of internal process to apply to furniture. He was beginning to wonder what else he had been applying insufficient process to. His phone rang. Not Celeste this time. Not Doyle. His brother Vincent, whose name appearing on Raphael's phone on a weekday morning meant either business or trouble. And the distinction between those two categories had never been especially clean. I heard, Vincent said when Raphael answered. No greeting. They hadn't done greetings since they were teenagers. How? Louisa talked to Elena this morning. Louisa was Vincent's wife, a practical, unsentimental woman who maintained a network of social connections throughout the family's extended world with the systematic efficiency of an intelligence operation. She told Louisa that Serena had moved out. That's all she said. Louisa told me. Raphael said nothing. You okay? Vincent said. Why does everyone keep asking me that? Because you're the kind of person no one usually asks that. So when something happens that warrants the question, nobody knows how to approach it, and they default to the obvious. Vincent paused. I'm coming over. Don't. I'm not asking. The call ended. Vincent had always operated this way, not with aggression, but with a low-level intractability that simply outlasted any resistance applied to it. He would arrive when he arrived, and Raphael accepted this as one of the fixed conditions of having a brother. Vincent came through the front door 40 minutes later without knocking, because he had a key, and because knocking was a formality they had abandoned decades ago. He was 3 years younger than Raphael and built similarly, the same dark hair going gray at the temples, the same deliberate, measured way of moving through a space. The primary difference between them was that Vincent had, at a certain point in their shared history, made a decision to build something less consuming and more survivable, and that decision had given him a quality Raphael occasionally recognized as peace and more frequently categorized as limitation. He came into the kitchen, looked at the divorce papers on the table, and pulled out the chair across from Raphael without being invited. "When?" he said. "Filed 3 days ago. She moved out overnight." "You didn't know it was coming." It wasn't a question. Raphael looked at him. "No." Vincent sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I knew she was unhappy." The words landed like something dropped from a height. Raphael felt them hit and didn't immediately respond, which was its own kind of response. "You knew," Raphael said. "Louisa knew. She told me about a year ago that Serena had the look." "What look?" "The look Louisa gets when she's about to do something permanent," Vincent said. "She recognized it because she knows it from herself. She almost left me in 2014. You didn't know that either." Raphael stared at him. "You never—" "What was I going to say? My wife almost left me, and by the way, yours might too." "This isn't the kind of information that moves well in our family, Raphael." Vincent leaned forward and set his forearms on the table, looking directly at his brother. "Did you ever ask her if she was okay?" "She was taken care of." "That's not what I asked." "She had everything." "That is not what I asked." Vincent's voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was worse. "I asked if you ever sat down with your wife and asked her whether she was okay, whether she was happy, whether she felt like a person in her own life or a piece of the inventory of yours." The kitchen was very quiet. "You were going to make it work," Vincent said. "That's what you told me when you married her. You said you were going to make the marriage work." He paused. "You say that about everything, Raphael. Projects, territories, contracts. You make things work. But a marriage isn't a contract you execute. It's a person you have to keep choosing. And you—" He stopped himself, looked away briefly, then back. "You stopped choosing her a long time ago." "I never stopped." "You were with Celeste Rowan last night," Vincent said. Flat, direct, not cruel, just precise. "You've been with her for 3 years. Serena knew. She's known for a while. I don't know exactly how long, but Louisa thinks she's known for at least a year." Raphael looked at the table, at the divorce papers, at the grain of the farmhouse wood beneath them. "And she didn't say anything," he said. It came out quieter than he intended. "No," Vincent said. "She didn't say anything. She just started making plans." He pushed back slightly from the table but didn't stand. "I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here because you're my brother and I know what you're going to do next." Raphael looked at him. "You're going to find her," Vincent said. "You're going to use every resource you have to locate her, and then you're going to decide whether to approach her or stay back. And either way, you're going to believe that your choice still has some power over how this ends. And I'm telling you right now, it doesn't. She didn't leave you to get your attention. She left because she was finished. There's a difference." The rain outside had slowed to almost nothing, a fine mist now, barely visible against the gray afternoon. "What do you want me to do?" Raphael said. "Just sign the papers and move on." "I want you to understand what happened before you do anything," Vincent said. "Because if you don't understand it, you'll make it about getting her back, and this isn't about getting her back. This is about figuring out how you became someone a good woman had to escape from." The words sat between them on the table beside the divorce papers and the empty coffee cups and the gray light from the window. Raphael didn't answer. Vincent stood up, pushed the chair in, and put one hand briefly on his brother's shoulder. Not a gesture of comfort exactly, more a gesture of acknowledgement. Then he walked out of the kitchen, through the hallway, and out the front door. The sound of the latch clicking behind him was very clean and final in the silent house. Raphael sat alone at the farmhouse table for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his attorney, because there were papers that needed a response and deadlines that didn't care about emotional timelines. And whatever he was going to do with the understanding his brother had handed him, the first step was still administrative. His attorney, a precise and unsentimental man named Gerard Foss, answered on the first ring. "I've received divorce papers," Raphael said. "I want to review the terms." "Of course," Foss said. "Do you want to contest?" Raphael looked at the papers on the table, at the single line on the second page in Serena's handwriting, at the 4 words she hadn't written, the explanation she hadn't provided, the anger she hadn't expressed. "I don't know yet," he said. He heard Foss begin to speak again, something practical about filing windows and response timelines, and then a notification appeared on Raphael's phone screen. A message from Doyle. Not a call. A message which Doyle used only when the information was specific and didn't require discussion. The message contained a name and an address Raphael didn't recognize, followed by a single additional line. "She's meeting with someone tomorrow morning. He's not a lawyer. Preliminary indicates personal connection. Her past, not yours. You should know before you decide anything." Raphael stared at the message. Foss was still talking on the other end of the line. "Gerard," Raphael said, cutting through whatever the attorney had been saying. "I'll call you back." He ended the call. He read Doyle's message again. Her past, not yours. A man. Someone from Serena's life before she had become Serena Viscari, before she had stepped into the architecture of his world and arranged herself within it with a grace and intelligence he had observed and appreciated and ultimately taken for granted. Someone from the version of her life that had existed before him, which he had never asked about with any real interest, because he had been primarily occupied with the version of her life that existed as part of his. He sat with the phone in his hand and the mist against the window and the empty house moving quietly around him. And something shifted in his chest, not the cold, analytical weight of this morning, but something hotter and less manageable, something that lived closer to the surface and was considerably more dangerous, the specific kind of feeling that a man like Raphael Viscari had spent 30 years learning to convert immediately into action. He set the phone down on the table. He picked it up again. He put it in his jacket pocket without responding to Doyle. Tomorrow morning, Serena would be meeting someone. Someone Raphael didn't know. Someone from the life she had been quietly rebuilding for 8 months, while standing beside him at charity galas and answering questions about catering and smiling at the right moments, with an expression he had read as composure and which he now understood had been something else entirely. The performance of a woman who had already decided, already planned, already said goodbye in every way that mattered, and was simply waiting for the timing to be right. He had let her go. He hadn't meant to, but he had. Not in a single moment of conscious choice, but across 1,000 small moments of inattention, each one so minor as to be invisible on its own, accumulating silently over years into something irreversible. And now someone else was sitting across a table from her tomorrow morning, and Raphael didn't know the name or the nature of it, only that it was something from her past that he had never bothered to learn. And the feeling that came with not knowing was something he recognized with a cold, precise shock as jealousy. Not the performative jealousy of a man asserting ownership, but the real kind, the animal kind, the kind that arrives only when you understand for the first time what you are actually losing. He stood up from the farmhouse table and walked to the window. The mist had stopped. The garden beyond the glass was wet and still and very quiet. He stood there until the light began to fail, which in March happened early and without ceremony, and by the time the garden had gone fully dark, he had made a decision. Not about whether to contact Serena, not about the divorce papers, not about any of the administrative machinery that needed to begin grinding forward. A different decision, a smaller one, the kind that precedes the larger ones and determines their direction. He was going to find out who she was meeting, and whatever he learned tomorrow morning was going to determine whether the man who had built an empire on the principle that nothing in his world could change without his permission was capable of changing something in himself, or whether he was simply going to do what powerful men do when they finally feel the ground shift beneath them. He was going to do what they always did. He was going to reach for control. And the terrible thing, the thing he almost understood standing at the dark window in his empty house, was that reaching for control was precisely what had brought him here in the first place. He didn't sleep. He lay on the bed, Serena's side, his side, both of them equally empty now, and stared at the ceiling until 3 in the morning, then gave up on the pretense of rest and went downstairs to the study. He made coffee he didn't drink and sat at the desk with the lamp on and Doyle's message still open on his phone. Her past, not yours. He read it approximately 11 times, not because the words changed, but because the mind, when it cannot stop moving, finds a fixed point and circles it. At 4:15 he called Doyle. Doyle answered immediately, which confirmed he also hadn't been sleeping, or had been sleeping in the particular shallow way that men in their profession learned to sleep. Always one layer below full consciousness, always reachable. "The meeting tomorrow," Raphael said. "Where?" "Coffee shop in the Meridian district, 3 blocks from the Voss apartment where Serena's staying. Place called Archer's, opens at 7. "What time is the meeting?" 8:30. Raphael checked the clock on the wall of the study. 4:17, just over 4 hours. "The man she's meeting, you have a name." "Daniel Rice," Doyle said. 44, architect, lives in the city, works for a firm called Rice Garland, which he co-founded 8 years ago. Clean record. No connections to our network, no criminal history, nothing. He went to Hartwell College, same school as Serena, same years. They overlapped for 2 years before she transferred. Raphael absorbed this. "Architect." "Yes." "And you know they were in contact how?" "Her new phone account shows text traffic to a number registered to Rice starting approximately 6 weeks ago. I can't access the content. I can only see frequency and duration. It's been consistent, 3-4 exchanges a week. Call duration averages around 20 minutes when they talk. 20 minutes. 3 or 4 times a week for 6 weeks. Raphael did the math without intending to, the numbers assembling themselves automatically in the part of his mind that calculated things before he could stop it. That was somewhere between 70 and 100 individual exchanges. 70 to 100 conversations with a man from her past, conducted quietly on a private phone, while Serena was still living in his house, sleeping in his house, hosting his events and sitting across from him at that farmhouse table. "You think it's personal," Raphael said. The word personal came out in a register he hadn't intended, tighter, compressed in a way that Doyle would hear and catalog. "I think it's something," Doyle said carefully. "I don't know what kind of something. I want eyes on the meeting." Silence for 2 seconds. "Raphael?" "Don't." "I'm not objecting," Doyle said. "I'm asking you to consider what you're going to do with whatever you see. Because watching the meeting is one thing. What comes after watching the meeting is a different thing, and I want to make sure we agree on the parameters before I put anyone in that coffee shop." It was the most words Doyle had ever used to ask a single question. Raphael recognized that this was intentional. "Observation only," Raphael said. "No approach, no contact, no intimidation of any kind." "Understood. I want to know what she looks like." Another small silence. "Okay," Doyle said. I mean what she looks like now. Whether she looks—" He stopped. He was not a man who struggled for words. The struggle itself was information. "Whether she's okay." "I'll handle it personally," Doyle said. The call ended. Raphael sat at the desk until daylight, not reading, not working, not doing any of the things that ordinarily filled his hours. He sat in the particular stillness of a man who has temporarily exhausted the part of himself that takes action and hasn't yet restarted the part that thinks clearly. Outside, the city went through its quiet pre-dawn mechanics. A garbage truck on the perimeter road, the distant sound of an early train, a dog barking somewhere in the estate's surrounding neighborhood before being silenced by a door. At 7, he showered, dressed without care, and ate half a piece of toast that Elena left on the counter without being asked, because Elena had been reading this household's emotional weather for 9 years and knew when to leave food without conversation. At 8:15, he got into the Escalade. He didn't tell Marco where they were going. He just said Meridian District, and Marco drove, and Raphael sat in the back with his phone face down on the seat beside him and watched the city pass. He did not go to Archer's Coffee. He had told Doyle observation only, and he meant it, mostly. He had Marco stop the car 2 streets away, in a parking structure on the corner of Delmore and 6th, on the 4th level where the sight lines were clean and the car would not be visible from street level. He sat in the car and waited. Doyle called at 8:47. "They've been inside for 12 minutes, Doyle said. He was speaking quietly, the particular low register of someone maintaining a public posture while conducting a private conversation. Corner table away from the window. She chose the seat with her back to the room. "She always sits with her back to the room," Raphael said. He didn't know why he said it. It was simply true. Serena had always preferred to face away from crowds in public spaces, A preference she had once explained had something to do with finding it easier to concentrate on the person in front of her when she wasn't peripherally tracking everything behind them. He had absorbed this detail years ago and stored it in the part of his memory that held operational information about people he needed to understand. Race is across from her, Doyle said. They've been talking since they sat down. No contact, no hands across the table, no physical. What does she look like? Raphael said. A brief pause. She looks good, Doyle said. She looks lighter. I don't know how else to say it. She's been smiling. The word smiling entered Raphael's chest like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. Is it? He stopped. Started again. Does she look like she's performing it? No, Doyle said, with a frankness that confirmed he'd paid close attention specifically to answer this question accurately. It looks real. Raphael stared through the windshield at the gray concrete of the parking structure. Marco was motionless in the front seat, present without being present, which was his particular professional gift. She's laughing now, Doyle said, quietly, not cruelly, just reporting. He said something. She's laughing. The silence Raphael held after that was not a comfortable one. It was the silence of a man confronting the specific, terrible image of someone he owned, had believed he owned, in the way powerful men believe they own things that are not possessions, being happy in a way that had nothing to do with him, being free in a way that was visible on her face from across a coffee shop to a man he'd deployed to watch her, which said something ugly about him that he was not quite ready to examine directly. Okay, Raphael said, stay until they leave. Report when they separate. He ended the call and sat in the car. 22 minutes later, Doyle called again. They're leaving together, Doyle said, walking south on Meridian toward the park. It doesn't look like they're going anywhere specific, just walking. Together. Raphael put the phone in his pocket and told Marco to drive. He didn't give a destination. Marco drove. They moved through the Meridian district and Raphael watched the sidewalks without looking for anything in particular because he had already told Doyle he wouldn't approach, and he was a man who kept his word to his own people even when keeping it cost him something. But his mind was doing the thing it always did under pressure, assembling information, running forward through scenarios, building a structure of possible outcomes and ranking them by likelihood and consequence. What he couldn't factor cleanly was Rice. Not because of anything specific about the man, Daniel Rice, our architect, 44, co-founder of Rice Garland, clean record, Hartwell College, but because Rice existed in the domain of Serena's internal life, which was precisely the domain Raphael had never mapped, and therefore couldn't navigate. He knew everything about his enemies. He knew their habits, their pressure points, their families, their finances, their fears. He knew these things because he had made it his practice to know them, to invest in understanding the full architecture of any person who could affect his world. He had never invested that practice in his wife. He had known her favorite books, her restaurant preferences, her clothing size, the specific flowers she favored, and the specific social situation she found draining, the operational data of coexistence. But the internal geography of Serena Aldridge, who she had been before she became Serena Viscari, what she had wanted for herself that hadn't included him, what she'd quietly buried over 12 years of living in the orbit of his priorities, that he had never asked about, and she, being the person she was, had never forced on him. He had handed her ignorance of herself like a gift and called it respect for her privacy. He arrived back at the estate at 11 and went directly to the study, where he found Doyle's full written report on the desk, printed because Doyle was meticulous about paper trails he controlled directly, and a second item he had not expected. A sealed envelope, hand-delivered, addressed to Raphael Viscari in handwriting he didn't immediately recognize. No return address. He looked at the envelope for a long moment, then he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The letterhead read, Calloway, Senna, and Marsh, Serena's attorneys. The letter itself was short, 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph confirmed the filing date and referenced the attached divorce documents already provided. The second paragraph stated in formal and precise legal language that his wife was not seeking additional assets beyond her legal entitlement, was not pursuing claims related to the nature of his business interests. and was requesting only that all proceedings be handled without direct contact between parties for a period of 30 days while both sides engaged with respective counsel. It was the third paragraph that changed the temperature of the room. The third paragraph stated that Serena Aldridge Vescari was formally requesting the return of one specific item currently held within the estate. A cedar box, approximately 12 inches by 8, containing personal correspondence belonging to her late mother, which had been stored in the lower left drawer of the master bedroom armoire for the duration of the marriage. The box was described as having no monetary value. The letter requested its return via courier to the Callaway firm's address. Raphael read the third paragraph twice. He set the letter on the desk and walked upstairs to the master bedroom. The armoire stood against the wall adjacent to the window, a large, dark-stained piece that had come with the house when they purchased it, and which they had kept because Serena had liked it, and Raphael had no opinion either way about furniture. He opened the lower left drawer. The cedar box was there. He lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked, which he hadn't remembered. He had seen it in the drawer across years of opening that drawer for various incidental reasons, and had registered it the way he registered most of the house's objects, as existing, as Serena's, and therefore as not requiring further consideration. He set it on the bed. He did not open it. He sat on the edge of the bed with the cedar box beside him, and thought about the fact that in 12 years of marriage, Serena had kept her mother's letters in the lower left drawer of an armoire in their shared bedroom, and he had never asked to read them, never asked what they said, never asked what her mother had been like beyond the biographical minimum that their social life occasionally required him to know. Her mother had died before he and Serena met. He knew the year. He didn't know the month. He didn't know whether she'd been sick for a long time or whether it had been sudden. He didn't know what kind of person she had been or what Serena had lost when she lost her, which was a different kind of knowing. He had lived beside the cedar box for 12 years and had never known what was in it, and Serena had lived beside a man for 12 years who had never thought to ask. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Not Doyle, not Vincent, not Celeste. A number he didn't recognize with a local area code. He almost let it ring through, but something, the morning's accumulation of unsettling information, the letter from the attorneys, the cedar box sitting on the bed beside him, made him answer. Mr. Vescari. A man's voice. Measured, not unfriendly, but carrying the specific weight of someone who has decided to make a call they've been deliberating about for some time. My name is Danielle Rice. I think you know who I am. The room went very still. Raphael did not move. He sat on the edge of the bed with the cedar box beside him, and felt the back of his neck go cold in the particular way it went cold when something unexpected arrived that had the potential to be significant. I know who you are, Raphael said. His voice was level. This required almost no effort. He had decades of practice keeping his voice level in situations that were not level. How did you get this number? Serena didn't give it to me, Rice said immediately. I want to be clear about that. She doesn't know I'm calling. She wouldn't want me to. I got your number through a mutual contact who has no idea why I wanted it. A pause. I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm not calling on behalf of anyone. I'm calling because there's something you need to know before you make any decisions about how to respond to the divorce filing. And I think you should hear it from a person rather than from a document. Raphael's jaw tightened by approximately a millimeter. Say what you have to say. Serena didn't contact me 6 weeks ago, Rice said. I contacted her. I'd been trying to reach her for longer than that. Almost 4 months. She didn't respond for the first 2 months. I want you to understand the sequence, because the sequence matters. Why did you contact her? A short silence. Then, because I knew her before you did, and I knew what she was like, and I had heard, through people we both grew up with, people with no connection to your world, that she wasn't well. Not physically, emotionally. Another pause. Apparently she had gone through something around 18 months ago that affected her significantly, something that made her withdraw from most of the friendships she'd maintained throughout the marriage. She went quiet in a way that worried people who cared about her. But Raphael's hand was holding the phone very still. I'm telling you this, Rice said, because I think you deserve to know that the woman you're divorcing was not fine. For a long time she was not fine. And she handled it alone, which is something she has always done, and which is in equal measure one of her greatest strengths, and something that should never have been necessary. What happened 18 months ago? Raphael said. The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long, which in a phone conversation is a considerable amount of silence. She found out about the other woman, Rice said. I think you know the one I mean, but that's not the part that broke something in her. She had suspected that for a while, apparently. What broke something was that she found out on the same afternoon that she had received news from her doctor that she wanted to discuss with you, something she had been hoping for that turned out not to be possible. She tried to call you 3 times that afternoon. You didn't answer. Raphael stopped breathing for a moment. He knew the afternoon. He didn't know that she had known that day about Celeste. He didn't know what the doctor had told her, but he remembered the 3 calls he had silenced because he had been with Celeste, and silencing them had felt practical. He had registered Serena calling 3 times on a single afternoon, and had processed it as mildly unusual and then had not thought about it again. He had not called her back that evening. He had come home late. She had been in bed, reading. He had said something about a difficult meeting, and she had said okay, and he had gone to the bathroom, and by the time he came to bed she was asleep, or she had appeared to be asleep. What did the doctor tell her? Raphael said. His voice came out differently than he intended. Rougher. Something had cracked slightly in the mechanism that kept it level. That's not mine to share, Rice said quietly. That's hers. But I'll tell you it was something she had wanted very much, and had been quiet about wanting, because she knew you were occupied, and she didn't want to impose the weight of wanting it onto a marriage that she was already carrying mostly alone. He paused. I'm telling you what I'm telling you because you're about to sign papers that will end your marriage, and I think you should do that with full knowledge of what you're ending and what it cost her. Not to change your mind, not to manipulate you, just because she deserves to be accurately known, even now, even by you. The line was quiet. Why do you care? Raphael said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Because I was in love with her 20 years ago, Rice said, with a directness that was almost shocking in its simplicity. And I'm not now. I want to be clear about that. What's happening between us is friendship. She needed a friend who existed completely outside your world, someone she could talk to without managing the implications of what she said. That's what I've been. Nothing more. A beat. But I know who she is, and I know what it looks like when someone who has been strong for too long finally stops. And I thought you should know that the woman who left your house in the middle of the night with a cedar box and her mother's letters, that woman was holding a lot more than a divorce when she walked out. Raphael sat on the edge of the bed. The cedar box was beside him. The phone was in his hand. Outside the bedroom window, the city continued with its indifferent machinery, and the afternoon light was starting to go amber in the way it went amber in March when the sun dropped early, and somewhere across the city, Serena Aldridge was walking in a park with a man who had noticed she wasn't fine when her husband had not. And the full weight of that sentence pressed down on Raphael Vescari with a force that was unlike anything his criminal empire had ever produced in him. Thank you for calling, he said. Rice said, take care of yourself, and ended the call. Raphael set the phone on the bed. He looked at the cedar box. He picked it up and held it in both hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. Her mother's handwriting in envelopes he had never seen. Words written to a daughter who had eventually become a woman he had lived beside without truly seeing, carrying this box from apartment to apartment, and finally into his house, and finally out of it in the middle of the night, while he slept beside another woman. He put the cedar box on the dresser. He went back downstairs. Doyle was in the kitchen, not sitting, standing near the window with a cup of coffee, which meant he had something to say and had been waiting for an appropriate moment to say it, which was Doyle's way of indicating that what he had to say was not good. Tell me, Raphael said. Doyle set the cup down. I got a call 20 minutes ago from a contact at the Meridian District Precinct. There's a conversation happening between someone in the City Council's office and the District Attorney's office. Financial Crimes Division. He paused. They've been building something for a while. It's not complete, but my contact says they're closer than we'd like. Raphael looked at him. How close? 60 days, maybe less. The trigger point was the new Port Authority contracts. Someone inside the authority has been cooperating. Doyle's voice was flat and careful. They're not looking at you directly yet. They're triangulating. But if they get the Port Authority cooperation on record, they'll have enough to justify broader discovery. The news arrived on top of everything else the day had produced, and instead of sharpening Raphael the way professional threats usually sharpened him, clarifying everything, reducing it to clean operational terms, it produced something different, a kind of exhaustion that sat in the bones rather than the muscles. He was 51 years old. He had been building and defending and expanding and managing and protecting since he was 19 years old, and the machinery of it had never stopped. And today, this specific unrelenting day, it had cost him more than any single day in 30 years of operation. He had lost his wife to his inattention. He had learned what his inattention had cost her. He was now being told his empire, the thing he had sacrificed the marriage to build, the thing that had made him unreachable and untouchable and a fixed point in a world of variables, was being slowly encircled by a legal structure he could not intimidate or buy his way out of without risk of making it significantly worse. He stood in the kitchen of his enormous empty house and understood, with a precision that was almost elegant in its cruelty, that he was about to lose everything at once. "What are our options?" he said. "Legally, we have exposure we can't fully manage," Doyle said. "I've spoken to Foss. He says the best outcome, the cleanest outcome, involves significant cooperation and significant restructuring of the Port Authority relationships, which means burning the contracts." A pause. "And possibly the people attached to them." Define possibly. "The two men who negotiated the contracts on our behalf, Harmon and Vega. If the DA's office gets to them first, they talk. If we get to them first—" Doyle stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Raphael looked at him for a long time. In 30 years, he had made certain kinds of decisions. He had made them without pleasure, but without excessive hesitation, because hesitation in his world was a form of weakness that other people's survival converted into opportunity. He had understood these decisions as necessary and had not examined them further because examination was a luxury that his position had never comfortably accommodated. He was examining one now. Harmon was 46. He had 3 children in middle school. He had worked inside the Port Authority for 12 years and had made compromises during that time that he would not have made if someone had not made them seem like the safer alternative. Vega was 38 and had a mother in assisted living whose bills Raphael's organization currently subsidized through a shell arrangement Vega almost certainly preferred not to examine too closely. These were the people Doyle was suggesting could be managed. Raphael looked at the farmhouse table, at the empty chairs, at the kitchen that smelled like Elena's coffee and nothing else, no reed diffuser, no cedar and floral, no presence of the woman who had chosen all of this and then unmade her choice and walked out into the pre-dawn dark with her mother's letters. "No," Raphael said. Doyle's expression shifted by a degree. "No, to which part?" "To Harmon and Vega," Raphael said. "We don't touch them." Doyle absorbed this. "Then they're going to talk. Probably. And when they talk—" "I know what happens when they talk," Raphael said. "I know exactly what happens." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the last of the afternoon light was going, the sky over the garden turning the specific dark blue that precedes real darkness. And the garden itself looked smaller than it usually looked, the way spaces shrink when the light fails. "Then what do you want to do?" Doyle said. Raphael stood in the kitchen of his empty house with his criminal empire developing a perimeter around it and his marriage dissolving in a family law firm 60 miles north and a cedar box upstairs containing letters he had never read. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water or like the specific sobriety that follows a very long night, that the man he had been for 30 years was not going to survive what was coming. Something was going to have to change. Not his strategy, not his legal posture, not his operational structure or his network management or his approach to the Port Authority exposure. Those were all problems with solutions, and the solutions would be found or they wouldn't, and the consequences would be what they were. What had to change was something that didn't have a tactical name. He looked at Doyle. "Get me Gerard Foss," he said. "Not by phone, in person, tomorrow morning. And call Vincent." Doyle nodded. "And send the cedar box to Callaway, Sene, and Marsh," Raphael said. "Tonight, by private courier. Make sure it's marked fragile." Doyle looked at him for a moment, not questioning, simply registering, and then picked up his phone to begin making the arrangements, and Raphael walked out of the kitchen and down the hallway and out the front door into the cold evening air. And he stood on the front steps of the estate with his hands in his pockets and his breath making small clouds in the darkness. And for the first time in 30 years, he had absolutely no idea what kind of man he was going to be when morning came. He stood on the front steps until his hands went numb. The cold was real. March in this city had a particular quality of cold that came not from the temperature alone, but from the moisture in it, the kind that got inside jacket collectors and collarbones and stayed there. But Raphael didn't go back inside. He stood on the stone steps of the estate and breathed the cold air in measured increments and let the darkness be what it was, which was just darkness, which was just the absence of light and nothing more dramatic than that. And he tried to locate somewhere inside himself the version of Raphael Viscari, who had always known what came next. He couldn't find him. That man, the one who had an answer before the question finished forming, who read 3 moves ahead the way other men read the room, who had built an empire on the principle that preparation was simply the application of sufficient intelligence to a sufficient amount of information. That man seemed to have stepped out sometime during the course of this specific day and not yet returned. What remained on the front steps was a 51-year-old man in an expensive jacket who had sent a cedar box across the city because he could not think of a single other thing to do that felt like the right thing. He went inside at 9:15. He did not sleep again. Gerard Foss arrived at 7 the following morning, which was earlier than requested and which communicated, without words, that Foss had been awake for hours processing whatever Doyle had told him and had decided that earliness was the appropriate response. Foss was 63, thin, with the kind of controlled precision in his appearance that came from decades of presenting himself in rooms where imprecision had consequences. He carried a leather portfolio that Raphael had seen in this study perhaps 40 times across 20 years of professional relationship, and he set it on the desk with the specific deliberateness of a man about to have a conversation he is thoroughly prepared for. Vincent arrived 12 minutes later, let himself in, came directly to the study, and sat in the chair beside the window without greeting either of them. His presence filled the room differently than Foss's, less formal, heavier, the weight of someone who carries family history in his posture. Raphael stood behind the desk. He didn't sit. He looked at both of them and said, "Tell me the actual shape of it, not the managed version, the actual shape." Foss opened the portfolio. The Port Authority investigation is further along than Doyle's contact indicated. I spoke to someone in the Financial Crimes Division, not directly, through an intermediary, and the picture is this. They have cooperative testimony from someone inside the authority who participated in 2 of the 3 contract negotiations. The 3rd contract is the one that carries the most exposure for you specifically because your direct involvement in the structuring is documentable. How documentable? Emails, Foss said, routed through a shell entity but traceable with the kind of forensic accounting they have access to when they obtain the right warrants. They don't have the warrants yet. They have probable cause to request them. The difference between where they are now and where they need to be to move against you directly is approximately 6 to 8 weeks, assuming no acceleration. What accelerates it? Harmon or Vega making contact with the DA's office independently, Foss said. If either of them decides that cooperation is preferable to whatever alternative they're weighing, and given that the alternative involves the kind of people your organization employs, the timeline compresses to days. Raphael looked at him. I've already told Doyle that Harmon and Vega are not to be touched. Foss held his gaze steadily. I know, Doyle informed me. I'm not suggesting they should be. I'm telling you that your decision not to touch them creates a specific risk, and I want to make sure you understand the nature of that risk clearly before we discuss options. I understand it. Then you understand that if they cooperate, I understand what happens if they cooperate, Raphael said. Move to options. Foss looked at him for a moment. Not challenging, just confirming. Then looked down at the portfolio. There are 3 viable paths. The first involves rapid restructuring of the Port Authority relationships and significant financial separation from the shell entities involved. This buys time, but doesn't eliminate exposure because the forensic trail still exists. He paused. The second path involves preemptive engagement with the DA's office through insulated counsel, offering cooperation on specific elements of the investigation in exchange for defined immunity parameters. This is the most legally protective option, but requires significant disclosure of organizational structure. And the third, Raphael said. The third path, Foss said carefully, involves accepting that the current structure of your operations is not sustainable under the level of legal scrutiny that is coming and beginning a managed transition away from the elements that carry criminal exposure. He closed the portfolio. A legitimate restructuring, aggressive, comprehensive, and irreversible. The room was quiet. Vincent, who had not spoken since arriving, said, "How long has Foss been recommending this?" 7 years, Foss said, without any particular inflection. Vincent looked at Raphael. Raphael looked at the closed portfolio on the desk. 7 years. Foss had been telling him for 7 years that the empire as constructed was a finite structure, not because it was weak, but because the environment around it was slowly changing in ways that made certain kinds of operation increasingly costly to sustain. Raphael had heard this and had processed it as the characteristic caution of a lawyer who didn't fully appreciate the operational realities, and had continued as he had continued because the machinery was running and running. Machinery feels like permanence until it stops. "How long does the transition take?" Raphael said. "Done properly?" 2 years minimum. "Done under legal pressure?" Foss paused. "Faster, but messier." "Start it," Raphael said. Both men looked at him. "Start the transition," Raphael said again. "Full restructuring. Whatever needs to be disclosed, disclose it through the right channels with the right protections. Whatever needs to be separated, separate it. Build the clean structure first, then worry about what survives the cleaning." Foss said, "Raphael, once we begin this process, I know what it means once we begin it. The organization as it currently exists, I know. People who rely on the current structure will, Gerard," Raphael's voice cut clean through the sentence, not loud, just final. "I know what it means. Do it." Foss looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up the portfolio and stood. "I'll need 48 hours to put together a framework." "You have 24. Foss left. Vincent didn't. He sat in the chair by the window with his forearms on his knees and his hands loosely linked and looked at his brother across the study with an expression that was not surprise. Vincent had stopped being surprised by Raphael some years ago, but something closer to careful attention, the way you look at something fragile that has unexpectedly held. "What changed?" Vincent said. "Everything," Raphael said. "That's not an answer." Raphael sat down behind the desk for the first time that morning, and the sitting was itself something, a small concession to the weight the day was already accumulating. "Rice called me yesterday." Vincent waited. "He told me what Serena was carrying 18 months ago when she found out about Celeste." He looked at the desk surface. "I had my phone off that afternoon because I was with Celeste. Serena called 3 times. She'd just come from a doctor's appointment and she needed to tell me something and I didn't answer." He stopped. Started again. "I don't know exactly what the doctor told her. Rice wouldn't say. But the way he said it..." He didn't finish. Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then, "Louisa thinks Serena wanted children." The words landed in the room like something physical. Raphael looked at his brother. "She mentioned it once to Louisa years ago, maybe 6 years. She said she thought about it sometimes, but that it didn't seem like the right time." Vincent's voice was carefully even. "Louisa thought she meant she was waiting for you to be ready, to slow down enough that children were something you could actually be present for." Raphael stared at the desk. 6 years ago, he had been in the middle of the Port Authority negotiations, the early stages of the expansion that had consumed the subsequent 4 years of his life, and produced the contracts that were now circling back toward him with legal consequence. He had been unreachable in the specific way that ambitious men are unreachable, physically present but operationally elsewhere, his attention a resource so thoroughly allocated that nothing personal could compete for allocation. He had never once discussed children with his wife. He had assumed, without examining the assumption, that the subject was settled, that Serena, who was organized and purposeful in every domain of her life, had either decided she didn't want children or had aligned herself with whatever he wanted, which was itself an assumption built on the foundation of never having asked. He had never asked. He put both hands flat on the desk and stared at them. His hands, the hands that had built
30 years of empire, that had signed contracts and enforced agreements and shaped the fear-based architecture of an entire criminal organization, were just hands. They were just the hands of a man who had not asked his wife a single question that mattered for the duration of their marriage. His phone rang. He looked at it. Unknown number, but local, same area code as Rice's call yesterday, and something in his gut, which was a reliable instrument even when everything else was unreliable, said, "Answer it." He answered. "Mr. Vescari." Not Rice this time. A woman's voice, controlled, professional, with the specific measured quality of someone who has made a decision to make this call and is not second-guessing it. "My name is Patricia Voss. You don't know me." He knew the name. Hartwell College. Clinical social worker. Meridian District. Serena's oldest friend, the woman whose apartment Serena was staying in. "I know who you are," he said. A short silence. "Then you've been having her watched." "I've been making sure she was safe," he said. "There's a distinction." "There really isn't," Voss said. "But that's not why I'm calling." She paused, and in the pause he could hear her making the same calculation Rice had probably made. How much to say, in what order, for what purpose. "I'm calling because Serena is my closest friend, and I've watched her manage things alone for longer than she should have had to. And I'm tired of the people who were supposed to take care of her not having information they should have." Another pause. "She's not well, Mr. Viscari. She hasn't been well for some time. She's been functional. She's one of the most functional people I know, which is part of why it's been easy to miss. But the last 18 months have been genuinely hard, and moving out, starting over, it's..." The voice tightened slightly. "She's doing the right thing. I believe that completely, and I just want to make sure you understand that walking away from your marriage cost her something real. And it's still costing her. And if you have any intentions of making her transition more difficult, legally, emotionally, through any kind of pressure, I'm not going to make it difficult," Raphael said. Silence. "I'm going to sign the papers as filed," he said. "No contest, no additional claims, no contact she hasn't initiated." He paused. "Is she okay?" Patricia Voss was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "She had a hard night last week. She doesn't sleep well. She's working through things that she probably should have started working through years ago and didn't because she was managing your household and your public life and not herself." The voice was not unkind. It was simply honest. The way a person is honest when they are tired of softening things for people who are capable of hearing the unsoftened version. "She'll be okay. She's one of the strongest people I know. But strong people have limits, and she's been at hers for a while." "Just why on this son? What can I do?" Raphael said. The question came out before he could examine it, and it was the right question. Not what leverage do I have, or what is my optimal position, or any of the tactical framings he would have applied a week ago, but simply, plainly, what can I do? And the fact of the question surprised him slightly, and from the silence on the other end of the line, it surprised Patricia Voss as well. "Sign the papers," she said. "Don't make it complicated. Don't have your lawyers find angles. Don't reach out looking for closure or conversation. If she wants that eventually, she'll initiate it." And she stopped. "The cedar box arrived this morning. She cried for about an hour. I don't know if that helps you, but I thought you should know." The line ended. He set the phone on the desk. He sat in the study for a long time without moving, and the house settled around him in the morning quiet. And outside somewhere, the city was doing what cities do, which is move and produce and transact without reference to any individual's internal condition. And Raphael Vescari sat in the wreckage of what he had built and began, slowly and without any particular grace, to understand the full inventory of what was in it. He picked up his phone at 11 and called Voss. "Start the divorce response today," he said. "No contest on any point. Sign whatever needs to be signed. Make it clean and make it fast. Whatever she's asked for, give it without discussion." Voss said, "There are some financial instruments that..." "Whatever she's asked for," Raphael said. "Do you understand me? Whatever she has requested. Not a dollar more as performance, not a dollar less as resistance. Exactly what she's asked for." He ended the call. At 1 in the afternoon, Doyle came to the study door and said quietly that there was a car parked at the end of the estate road that hadn't been there yesterday. Dark blue sedan, 2 occupants,
No visible plates from the gate camera, but the angle of the vehicle was consistent with surveillance positioning. Raphael looked at him. How long? Since this morning, before Foss arrived. They're watching the attorneys come and go. That would be my read, Doyle said. Raphael absorbed this with the particular steadiness that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having already accepted the worst probable outcome and decided to keep moving anyway. Let them watch, he said. We're not doing anything they need to know about. Everything that's happening now is through legitimate counsel, through legitimate channels. Let them see that. Doyle looked at him for a moment. You're not going to run. No. Some people in your position... I'm not running, Raphael said. Running creates the narrative they need. We're doing this through the front door. Doyle nodded slowly. Then, Harmon came in this morning. Raphael went very still. He came to the east gate at 7:40. Said he wanted to talk. I put him in the secondary conference room because I didn't know what you wanted to do with him. A pause. He's been there for 6 hours, Raphael. He hasn't asked for water. He hasn't asked to leave. 6 hours. A man sitting alone in a conference room for 6 hours without complaint was either terrified or had already made a decision and was waiting for the opportunity to deliver it. Raphael had no difficulty determining which category Harmon occupied. He stood up. Take me to him. The secondary conference room was at the east end of the first floor, adjacent to the security office, a windowless rectangular space furnished with a table, 4 chairs, and nothing else. Harmon was in the chair facing the door. A heavy-set man in his mid-40s with thinning hair and the particular complexion of someone who has not been sleeping. A grayish quality to the skin beneath the eyes that goes beyond fatigue into something more chronic. He was wearing a sport coat that didn't fit well over a dress shirt that was not ironed. He had not shaved recently. He looked up when Raphael came in and something moved across his face that was not quite relief and not quite dread, but occupied the murky territory between them. Raphael sat across from him. Doyle positioned himself near the door, not blocking it, but present. Raphael looked at Harmon and said nothing. He had long ago learned that silence in these situations was its own form of pressure. Not aggressive, not threatening, simply the absence of the social lubricant that makes people feel they can defer difficult things. Harmon lasted about 15 seconds. I got a call, Harmon said. His voice was rough, the rough quality of someone who has been rehearsing words for hours and lost confidence in all of them. From someone in the DA's Financial Crimes Division. They want to meet. He swallowed. They've been building something. They told me. They said that whoever comes in first gets the better end of the conversation. Raphael looked at him. I didn't go, Harmon said. I came here instead. I want you to know I came here instead. I see that, Raphael said. I have kids, Harmon said. 3 of them. My oldest is 16. I'm not a person who does well in... He stopped himself from finishing that sentence. I need to know what I'm supposed to do. Raphael looked at him for a long moment. Harmon's hands were on the table, flat, slightly trembling, the hands of a man who has been frightened for a long time and is no longer capable of concealing it. He was not a criminal in any fundamental sense. He was a man who had made decisions inside a compromised system because the system had made those decisions feel like the path of least resistance. And now the system was contracting around him and the decisions were becoming visible. Raphael recognized this. He had built the system that had produced Harmon's decisions. He had created the architecture of convenience and threat within which men like Harmon made choices they would not have made in a different environment. Whatever Harmon had done, Raphael had made it easier to do than not. Go home, Raphael said. Harmon blinked. What? Go home. Be with your family tonight. Raphael kept his voice level and quiet. My attorneys will contact you tomorrow through your personal counsel. You are going to cooperate with the DA's office fully and completely. You are going to tell them everything they ask, accurately, without omission. He paused. My attorneys will ensure that your cooperation is structured in a way that carries the minimum possible consequence for you personally. We will do this properly. Harmon stared at him. The expression on his face was something between incomprehension and a raw, undefended relief that a man of his particular pride was clearly embarrassed to be displaying. His jaw worked for a moment before words came. You're not... He stopped. I thought you were going to...
I know what you thought, Raphael said. Go home to your kids, Harmon. Harmon stood up from the table with the careful, unsteady movement of someone who has been sitting rigid with fear for 6 hours and whose legs have partially forgotten their function. He looked at Raphael once more at the door, not with gratitude exactly, because gratitude wasn't the right word for the specific complicated thing on his face. And then he left. Doyle closed the door behind him and turned to look at Raphael. Vega's going to hear about this by morning, Doyle said. I know. He'll go to the DA's office himself, preemptively. I know. When both of them cooperate, I know what happens when both of them cooperate, Doyle. Raphael stood up from the table. He felt it in his knees when he stood, a heaviness that was not quite physical, the kind of weight the body borrows from the mind when the mind has been running too long on insufficient rest and insufficient mercy toward itself. I need you to do something for me tonight. Name it. I want you to go see Celeste Rowan. He watched Doyle's expression register and hold steady. Not to threaten, not to pressure. I want you to go to her apartment and tell her from me that I'm sorry, that I handled things badly and I'm sorry. Don't say anything else, just that. Doyle absorbed this. She's not going to understand why you're sending me instead of going yourself. No, Raphael said, she's not. But if I go, it becomes something it shouldn't be, and she deserves a clean ending more than she deserves one more conversation with me. He paused. Tell her she should call her sister. She mentioned once that she and her sister had a falling out. Tell her I think she should call. Doyle was quiet for a moment. Then, okay. He left. Raphael stood alone in the empty conference room under the flat overhead light and pressed both palms against the table surface and breathed. In through the nose, out slowly, the way he'd been told to breathe 20 years ago by a man who had watched him manage a crisis for 72 hours without eating and had said, afterward, that if Raphael didn't learn to breathe, he would eventually break something central. He had not broken then. He thought he might be breaking now, not collapsing, not coming apart in any visible, dramatic way, but something in the internal structure, the architecture of absolute control he had constructed and maintained and defended for 30 years, was developing fractures. Not cracks he could repair, fractures along the load-bearing lines, the kind that spread. His phone rang. He looked at it. Foss. Talk to me, Raphael said. The DA's office made contact 20 minutes ago, Foss said. His voice had the particular quality it got when information was moving fast and he was processing in real time. Not through official channels, through an intermediary. They know we're talking. They want a meeting. Raphael felt his heart rate increase by precisely nothing, which surprised him slightly. He had expected fear. What arrived instead was something that had the same weight as fear, but a different texture, something that felt, strangely, like the first breath after a very long-held exhale. Set it up, he said. If we go into this meeting, Foss began. I know what it means if we go into this meeting. Raphael, once you're in that room, Foss. His voice was quiet, not hard, just decided. Set it up. A silence, then, I'll call you within the hour. He ended the call and stood in the empty conference room and thought about Serena waking up this morning in Patricia Voss's apartment and the cedar box arriving, and her crying for an hour over letters her mother had written to her before either of them knew that the daughter reading those letters would eventually spend 12 years in an enormous house with a man who never thought to ask what was in the box. He thought about the 3 phone calls he hadn't answered. He thought about Harmon's hands, flat and trembling on the table. He thought about Vega's mother in assisted living, and about Doyle's 7,000 hours of loyal silence, and about Vincent saying you stopped choosing her a long time ago, and about the farmhouse table that Serena had driven 4 hours round trip to reconsider before deciding she actually wanted it. He stood in the conference room under the flat light and waited for Foss to call back. And outside the estate, the dark blue sedan with its 2 occupants was still parked at the end of the road, watching the gate. And somewhere in the city, the DA's office was preparing for a meeting that was going to take apart 30 years of carefully constructed architecture. And somewhere in the Meridian district, a woman was reading her mother's letters and beginning, in whatever imperfect and necessary way human beings begin things, to be free. Foss called back at 6:47. Tomorrow morning, Foss said. 8 o'clock. Downtown Federal Building.
They want you present personally, not represented. I'll be there, Raphael said.
Raphael. Voss's voice carried something it rarely carried, which was the specific weight of genuine personal concern rather than professional obligation. You understand that tomorrow morning this is the point of no return. Once you walk into that building, the empire as you've built it is effectively, I know, Raphael said. Everything changes. I know. Are you sure?
Raphael looked at the flat wall of the conference room, at the nothing it contained, at the room that was simply a room and nothing more, and said, yes. He ended the call. He walked down the hallway, through the kitchen, and stood at the farmhouse table one more time. He put his hand flat on the wood surface. The wood Serena had driven 4 hours to decide she actually wanted, that she had left behind because it was too large to take and too heavy to move, and also perhaps because some things belong to a chapter that is finished and should remain there. His hand on the wood in the quiet house. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, everything would change. He stood there in the silence, with his heart beating at its ordinary rate in his chest, feeling neither brave nor afraid, but something that lived precisely between those two things. The specific, terrible, clarifying stillness of a man who has finally stopped running from the consequences of who he has been and is standing still at last, waiting for them to arrive. He didn't sleep the night before, not in the way of the previous nights, not the restless, circling insomnia of a man processing shock, but deliberately, consciously awake, sitting in the study with the lamp on and a glass of water he kept refilling and not drinking, letting the hours move at their own pace without trying to accelerate them. At 2 in the morning, he went to the kitchen and made toast and ate it standing at the counter, looking at the place where the cream envelope had sat 4 mornings ago. 4 mornings. It felt like a different geological era. It felt like something that had happened to a man he used to know. At 3:30, he went upstairs, showered, and dressed with more care than usual. Not the automatic reach for whatever was nearest, but a deliberate selection: the charcoal suit, the white shirt, no tie. He stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom for a moment and looked at his own face with the particular dispassion of someone taking inventory. 51 years old, gray at the temples, more than there used to be. Lines around the eyes that hadn't been there in his 40s. The face of a man who had spent 30 years indoors in lit rooms making decisions under pressure, which was its own kind of weathering. He went back downstairs at 5 and sat in the study until 6, reading nothing, doing nothing, simply being in the room that had been the nerve center of his operation for the past decade and allowing himself to feel the specific texture of what it was like to sit in it for possibly one of the last times as the man he had been. Marco drove him downtown at 7:15. The Federal Building on Crescent Avenue was a wide, flat-fronted structure with the particular institutional blankness of buildings designed to communicate authority through the absence of personality. Raphael had been inside it twice before, both times as a private citizen with no stake in what was being decided inside it, and it had looked like a building both times. This morning it looked like a building he was walking into, and from which he would emerge as something irreversibly different from what he had been when he entered. Foss was waiting at the bottom of the front steps. Beside him, a woman Raphael didn't know, mid-40s, dark coat, the composed expression of someone who has been in difficult rooms and knows how to take up exactly the right amount of space in them. Foss introduced her as Margot Delacroix, co-counsel, criminal defense, who had joined the matter overnight. Raphael shook her hand, noted the firm grip, noted that she looked at him without assessment or apology, which were both qualities he respected. Before we go in, Foss said, I need you to understand the parameters of this morning clearly. We are opening a dialogue. This is not a confession, it is not a guilty plea, it is not a binding agreement of any kind. It is a structured preliminary conversation about the potential terms under which you might cooperate with their investigation. Nothing said today is admissible without a signed proffer agreement, which we will not sign today. Understood, Raphael said. The lead prosecutor is a woman named Ida Chen, Delacroix said. Her voice was low and unhurried. She's been with financial crimes for 11 years. She's thorough, she's patient, and she does not posture. If she says something, she means it. If she offers something, it's real. She paused. She's also not interested in theater. Neither should you be. I'm not, Raphael said. He looked up at the building. Then he walked up the steps. The conference room on the fourth floor was smaller than he expected. Not the large gallery-style rooms he associated with significant legal proceedings, but a practical rectangle with a window overlooking an interior courtyard, a table that seated 8 water pitchers at both ends. 3 people were already seated on the far side of the table when Raphael, Foss, and Delacroix came in. 2 men he didn't know, younger, suited, with the specific alert stillness of people whose job is to observe and document, and a woman at the center who was Aida Chen. She was compact, professionally dressed in a gray blazer, with dark hair cut short, and eyes that moved to Raphael the moment he entered and stayed there with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone who has been studying him for a very long time from documents and is now making adjustments for the 3-dimensional version. She stood and shook hands without warmth and without hostility. Just her hand, his hand, and a brief, firm contact. "Mr. Vescari," she said, "thank you for coming in." "Thank you for the meeting," he said. They sat. Chen set her hands flat on the table in front of her lap. No files open, no documents visible, just her hands and her attention and the window light behind her, and said, "I want to start by being honest with you about where we are, because I find that honesty at the beginning of conversations like this saves significant time." She looked at him steadily. "We have sufficient evidence to convene a grand jury. We have 2 cooperative witnesses inside the Port Authority, one of whom was present at all 3 contract negotiations. We have forensic accounting that traces financial movement through 4 shell entities back to your direct control. And we have 6 weeks of communication records between those entities and your organization's legal and financial representatives." Raphael said nothing. "What we don't have," Chen continued, "and what we would prefer to have, is a complete picture of the network. Not just the Port Authority piece, the full operational structure, who, what, where, and how much, going back 10 years. She paused. "In exchange for that picture provided fully and accurately, we are prepared to discuss a framework that involves structured penalties, supervised restructuring of your legitimate business holdings, and defined personal consequences that are significantly less severe than what a grand jury indictment and subsequent trial would produce." She stopped talking. The room was quiet. One of the 2 men beside her was writing, the other was watching Raphael. Raphael looked at Chen. "What do you mean by defined personal consequences?" "I mean," Chen said carefully, "that what you experience personally at the end of this process will depend heavily on the quality and completeness of your cooperation. I am not in a position to make promises this morning. I am in a position to tell you that the difference between a man who walks in here voluntarily and a man who is indicted and forced to proceed defensively is a difference that matters when we make our ultimate recommendations." Foss said, "We'll need specific parameters in writing before any substantive discussion of organizational structure." "Of course," Chen said. She looked at Foss briefly, then back to Raphael. "Is there anything you want to say before we proceed to the documentation stage?" Raphael sat in the chair with his hands in his lap and his back straight and looked at the woman across the table who had spent the better part of 2 years building the structure that was now surrounding him. And he thought about what he wanted to say, and what he actually said was, "I want to make sure the people inside my organization who cooperated with your investigation are protected appropriately. Harmon, Vega. Whatever framework we build, they go in with full immunity, non-negotiable." Chen looked at him. Something in her expression shifted by a degree. Not surprise, not approval, just a minor recalibration of whatever she had expected this conversation to be. "That can be arranged," she said. "And there are people in my network who are not criminal actors," Raphael said. "People who provide legitimate services, logistics, hospitality, finance, who had no knowledge of the elements you're investigating. I want a clear process by which those people and their livelihoods are distinguished from the elements under scrutiny." "We're not interested in destroying legitimate businesses," Chen said. "I know what you're interested in," Raphael said. "I'm asking for a process. In writing. Before we go further." Chen looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded to one of the men beside her who opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "This is the proffer framework as we've drafted it. Review it with your counsel. If the parameters are acceptable, we sign it today and begin the substantive conversation." Foss and Delacroix each took the document and began reading it with the focused, rapid attention of people who read documents the way other people breathe. automatically, continuously, registering everything. Raphael did not look at the document. He looked at the window. The interior courtyard below was empty at this hour. Concrete and a few planters with something dormant in them, not yet spring, not quite winter, occupying the specific ambiguous status of things that are in the process of becoming something else. He looked at the courtyard and thought about the farmhouse table and the cedar box and Serena crying for an hour in Patricia Voss's apartment, and about Harmon's trembling hands on the conference room table, and about Vincent saying, "You stopped choosing her a long time ago," and about the 3 phone calls he hadn't answered on an afternoon 18 months ago. When 2 things were happening simultaneously that he hadn't known were connected, he thought about the single line on the second page of the divorce papers. "I didn't leave angry. I left free." He looked back at the table. "Sign it," he said to Foss. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes. Raphael spoke in the measured, comprehensive way he spoke when he had decided that a thing needed to be done and done completely, not with relish, not with self-flagellation, simply with the systematic honesty of a man who had decided that the version of himself he was building from this day forward was not compatible with the version that had operated through omission and misdirection. He told Chen's team what they needed to know. Not everything. Some things had no bearing on their investigation and were not offered, but everything relevant, every structure, every name, every channel that had operated in the shadows of his legitimate holdings. He watched Chen's assistant fill pages. He answered questions with the same directness he would have applied to any other operational problem. At one point, Chen looked up from a document she was reviewing and said simply, "Why are you doing this?" She said it not as a prosecutorial question, but as a genuine one. The question of a person trying to understand the internal logic of what they're witnessing. Raphael looked at her. "Because I've spent 30 years building something that required me to become a specific kind of person," he said. "And I've recently learned what that person cost the people around him. And I'm 51 years old, and I'd like to see what's on the other side of this." Chen looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to her document. At 12:40, the meeting concluded. The framework was signed. The process was begun. It would take many more meetings, many more hours, many more documents before the full scope of what had been set in motion was visible. But the direction was set, and directions, once genuinely committed to, have their own momentum. He walked out of the federal building into the March noon light, which had become, while he was inside, something that actually resembled spring, warmer, with a different quality of brightness, the kind that carries the suggestion of eventual leaves. Foss and Delacroix stood on the steps with him and gave him a clear-eyed briefing on next steps, timelines, what to expect from the process, what would become public, and when. He listened and asked practical questions and noted the answers. When Foss finished, he said, "You did the right thing in there." "I did the necessary thing," Raphael said. "The right thing would have looked different and happened earlier." Foss nodded, accepting this without argument, because Foss was a man who dealt in precision, and the precision of Raphael's statement was irrefutable. Marco was waiting at the curb. Raphael got into the car and sat in the silence of the back seat as Marco pulled into traffic, and for the first time in 5 days, he felt something in his chest that was neither cold weight nor hot panic, but something quieter. The specific, unfamiliar sensation of a man who has stopped pretending that the ground beneath him is solid when it is not. The ground was not solid. It had not been solid for a long time. But at least he was standing on the actual ground now, instead of the version he had constructed to avoid acknowledging what lay beneath. He called Vincent. "It's done," he said when Vincent answered. A short silence. "How bad?" "It'll be public in a few weeks when the filings begin. The organization as structured is finished. The legitimate holdings survive if we manage the restructuring correctly." He paused. "My name is going to be in print." "I know," Vincent said. "Louisa knows. We talked about it this morning." Another pause. "Are you okay?" "I don't know yet," Raphael said. For the 3rd or 4th time since Monday, he was giving a truthful answer to that question, and each time it came slightly more easily than the last, which seemed like the kind of marginal progress available to a man in his position. "I will be." "Come for dinner tonight," Vincent said. "Louisa's cooking. The kids will be there. It'll be loud and someone will spill something and it'll be exactly what it is." Raphael looked out the car window at the city moving past. "Yeah," he said. Okay. He ended the call. The city looked different from the back of the car than it had looked 5 days ago on the drive back from Celeste's apartment. He couldn't precisely define the difference. The streets were the same streets, the buildings were the same buildings, the people moving through them were engaged in the same transactions as always. But he was looking at it now without the specific mental overlay that powerful men apply to the things around them. The constant, unconscious appraisal of what belongs to you, what you control, what can be managed or leveraged or converted into some form of advantage. He was looking at the city the way he might have looked at it when he was 19 years old and had not yet decided what he was going to become. He had the thought, sitting in the car, that this was probably what Serena had meant by the word free. Not the absence of difficulty. She was clearly still inside significant difficulty, working through things that were costing her sleep, and something more fundamental than sleep. But the absence of the specific weight that comes from living inside a structure built by someone else's ambitions, on someone else's terms, at someone else's pace. He had never given her the chance to build her own. He had built everything around her and called it protection, and mistaken the architecture for the relationship. The car stopped at a light on Delmore Avenue, 3 blocks from Archer's Coffee, where 4 days ago Serena had sat at a corner table with her back to the room and laughed at something Daniel Rice had said. And Doyle had reported this to Raphael in a parking structure, and Raphael had sat with it in the way men sit with things they cannot categorize and therefore cannot control. He looked at the corner where Archer's would be, 3 blocks south, and he did not ask Marco to drive there, because there was nothing in that direction that belonged to him anymore. And he was trying to learn, late and imperfectly and at considerable cost, what it felt like to leave things that didn't belong to him where they were. The light changed. Marco drove. 3 weeks later, Raphael Vescari's name appeared in the financial section of 2 city newspapers and 1 national publication, in articles about the federal investigation into Port Authority contracting irregularities. The reporting was factual, measured, and occupied approximately 6 column inches before being replaced the following day by other things, because the city had its own continuous momentum, and no single story held its attention for long. The articles mentioned a cooperative agreement. They mentioned the restructuring of several private business entities. They were careful and specific in the way financial journalism is careful and specific, focusing on the institutional rather than the personal. The divorce finalized on a Tuesday in late April, clean, uncontested, processed with the administrative efficiency of legal proceedings that encounter no resistance from either party. Voss confirmed it by email at 2 p.m, 4 words in the subject line. Finalized. All documents filed. Raphael read the email at his desk in the study. In the house he was in the process of listing for sale because a house that size required a reason to maintain it, and he no longer had the reason. And he sat with the 4 words for a long moment before closing the email and going back to the restructuring documentation he had been reviewing. He sold the estate in May. Not quickly, not desperately, but deliberately, at a price that was fair rather than strategic, to a family. A detail that the real estate broker mentioned and that Raphael noted without comment but did not discard. He moved into an apartment in the city's western district, a 5th-floor unit with good light and no security team and a kitchen that was approximately the size of the old estate's pantry, which suited him. He did not replace the furniture he left behind. He bought what he needed from 3 stores over 2 weekends and assembled what required assembly, which turned out to be most of it. And he did this alone because assembling furniture alone is an activity that resists pretension absolutely and therefore suited his current state of mind. Doyle left the organization in June, not abruptly, but with the clean finality of a man who had been waiting for a door to open and walked through it when it did. He moved out of the city to a smaller place north, and Raphael shook his hand on the last day and said, "You were worth more than I paid you." Doyle looked at him for a moment and said, "I know," which was the most precise exchange of mutual honesty either of them had managed across 11 years of professional relationship, and it felt more like a friendship than anything that had preceded it. Vincent called on this last Sunday in June, a warm evening that had finally committed to being summer, and said that Louisa had run into a mutual acquaintance who had mentioned that Serena was doing well, that she had taken a position with a nonprofit arts organization in another city, that she was apparently thriving in a way that involved a different quality of energy than the careful, managed competence she had applied to her life inside Raphael's world. Raphael listened to this without response for a moment. Then he said, "Good. That's all you have to say? What else should I say?" "I don't know," Vincent said. "I thought you might have more." "She's thriving," Raphael said. "What else is there?" The silence on Vincent's end was the kind of silence that occurs when a person expects complexity and encounters something simpler and has to recalibrate. Then, "You've changed." "I'm working on it," Raphael said, which was more accurate. Not "I have changed, but I am working on it." The distinction between a completed state and an ongoing process, which was itself evidence of a different kind of thinking than he had previously been capable of. He sat at the window of his apartment that Sunday evening and looked at the street below, which was full of the ordinary mechanics of a summer evening in a city. People walking dogs, couples on the sidewalk, a kid on a bicycle going too fast and then faster, a bodega owner rolling in his outdoor displays as the light faded. He watched all of this without managing it, without assessing it, without applying any of the mental frameworks that had organized his perception of the world for 30 years. And what he felt sitting at the window was something he hadn't felt in so long that he initially misidentified it. It was the feeling of being present in his own life, not managing it, not constructing it, not engineering the conditions of it to minimize risk and maximize control. Just being in it, in a summer evening, in a modest apartment with furniture he'd assembled himself, watching a kid on a bicycle disappear around a corner. He thought about Serena, not with the hot, animal jealousy of the parking structure, not with the cold weight of the study and the cream envelope, but with something closer to what he imagined she had written in those 7 words. Not anger, not longing, not the desperate reaching of a man toward something he has lost, but a kind of considered, honest acknowledgement of what had been real. She had been remarkable. She had been patient past any reasonable expectation. She had carried more than she should have been asked to carry, and had done so with a grace he had registered and not honored and eventually lost the right to. He hoped she was happy, not performatively, not as a thing to tell himself, but genuinely, the plain, uncomplicated hope of a man who has stopped believing that another person's happiness is a variable he has any right to influence. He hoped she was laughing the way Doyle had described, the real version, not performed, visible on her face from across a coffee shop. He hoped she had what she had wanted. Whatever the doctor had told her on that Tuesday afternoon 18 months ago when she had called 3 times and he hadn't answered, whatever it was she had wanted and grieved quietly and alone, he hoped the next chapter of her life contained some version of it, in whatever form life was still capable of providing. He hoped, sitting at the window on a Sunday evening in June, that she was free in the way she had said she left. Not free from difficulty, not free from the ordinary weight of living, but free from the specific suffocating freedom of a woman whose life has been consumed by the architecture of someone else's ambitions. He didn't write to her. He didn't ask Doyle, who was living up north now, in a house with a garden, to check on her. He didn't ask Vincent or Louisa for updates beyond what they offered voluntarily. He made no contact, attempted none, created no conditions in which contact might occur. She had asked for 30 days of space, and he had given her every day since, not as restraint but as respect. The difference being that restraint implies the desire to do otherwise, and what he felt was something different, the settled understanding that her life was not his to access, and that respecting this was not a sacrifice but simply the minimum requirement of decency that he owed her after everything he hadn't managed to give her while he had the chance. In July, he began meeting weekly with a therapist named Dr. Marcus Webb, a referral from Delacroix, who had said, without judgment, that clients going through the kind of structural life reconstruction Raphael was navigating often found it useful to have a thinking partner who was not a lawyer. Webb was 60, unhurried, with a listening style that gave almost no cues about what he was thinking, which Raphael initially found frustrating and eventually came to understand was the point. He talked in those sessions about things he had not previously talked about anywhere, not exclusively about Serena, not exclusively about the empire or the investigation or the dissolution of 30 years of construction, but about the 19-year-old who had decided to build something powerful because something powerful had seemed, at 19, like the solution to everything that had ever frightened him. About what that decision had produced, about what it had cost specifically, in the currency of people. Webb didn't tell him what to think. He just kept asking the next question. It was, Raphael reflected after the 8th session, the most useful conversation he had encountered in possibly his entire adult life, And it cost him nothing except honesty, which was the one resource he had spent 30 years carefully rationing. By August, the legal process had moved into its intermediate stages, complex, paperwork-intensive, managed by Foss and Delacroix, with competent and appropriate grimness. Raphael appeared when required, provided what was requested, and otherwise occupied himself with the reconstruction of his legitimate business holdings, which turned out to be substantial and viable once disentangled from the elements that had compromised them. The hospitality group was the strongest. He focused there, working in a way he hadn't worked in years, not from a position of leverage, but from genuine engagement with the mechanics of building something, which turned out to feel different than he remembered it feeling when he was young, before acquisition replaced creation as his primary motivation. He hired well. He paid well. He treated people who worked for him as people and not as components of an operational structure, which was a change that seemed small from the outside and felt enormous from the inside. One morning in September, the first cold morning that actually felt like fall, with the light at a low angle and the air carrying the smell of the season turning, he walked to Archer's Coffee in the Meridian District. He didn't know why he chose that particular morning or that particular place. Serena was not there. She was in another city, thriving, making a life he knew almost nothing about and had no claims on. The coffee shop was simply a coffee shop, a corner table with morning light, unremarkable in every respect except the one he carried with him as he opened the door and sat down and ordered coffee. He actually drank this time. He sat at the window, not the corner table with the back to the room, which was occupied, but a seat facing out, facing the street, and watched the Meridian District do its morning things. Foot traffic. A man walking a large dog. Two women in running clothes passing with the purposeful rhythm of people who run together regularly. A delivery truck blocking one lane of traffic while the driver, unhurried, unloaded cardboard boxes onto a dolly. He drank his coffee. He thought about nothing in particular. For a man who had spent 30 years thinking about everything with systematic, relentless, exhausting precision, thinking about nothing in particular was an achievement he had not previously associated with the category of achievement. But it was It was precisely that, the quiet, unremarkable, deeply human achievement of sitting in a coffee shop on a fall morning without an agenda, without a network to manage or a threat to neutralize or a position to defend, and being simply and sufficiently present in the moment as it was. He finished the coffee. He left a reasonable tip. He walked back out into the September morning, turned his collar up against the cold, and walked north through the Meridian District toward no particular destination, his hands in his pockets and his breath making small clouds in the air, and the city moved around him with its indifferent, continuous, magnificent life. And he moved through it, not above it, not behind glass, not in the armored back seat of a car arranged to insulate him from its texture, but through it, on foot, at street level, the pace of a man who was no longer in a hurry to arrive anywhere because he was finally already somewhere. A phone rang in his pocket. He answered without looking at the screen. It was Vincent. "Louisa wants to know if you're coming Sunday." "Yes," Raphael said. "She's making that thing you like. The pasta. The pasta." "Tell her yes," Raphael said. "Tell her I'll be there." He kept walking. The street ran north for several blocks before opening into a small park, the kind of neighborhood park that exists not because it is grand, but because the city occasionally makes room for the ordinary human requirement of a few trees and a bench and some distance from the sound of traffic. Raphael walked into it without deliberating and sat on a bench in the weak September sun and let the quiet of it be what it was. He thought about the bedroom on that first morning, the empty closet, the clean hangers, the cream envelope on the kitchen counter. He thought about the line in Serena's handwriting, so compact and precise and honest that it had functioned less like a final statement and more like a diagnosis. "I didn't leave angry. I left free." He sat with it now without the weight it had carried in the first days, not without feeling, not without the specific, earned sadness of a man who understands clearly what his failures produced and cannot unknow it, but without the panicked grasping that had characterized his first responses, without the instinct to control or recover or reverse. Just the clear-eyed acknowledgement of what had been and what it had cost, and what the cost had taught him about what he was capable of becoming. He had not become it yet. He was not under the illusion that recognition and transformation were the same event. But he was working on it, daily, imperfectly, with the particular humility of a man who arrived late to the understanding that the most important construction project of his life was not an empire. It was himself. The sun moved behind a cloud and the park went briefly gray, and then the sun came back, and it was September again. And the leaves on the trees above him were beginning, very slightly, at the edges, to turn. He sat there until the cold made sitting still uncomfortable, and then he stood up and put his hands in his pockets and walked back out of the park and into the street, and the city received him without fanfare, without acknowledgement, without any recognition of what he had been or what he was becoming, because the city, like life, does not award anything for the private work of change. It simply continues, and he continued with it, walking north in the September morning, one step and then the next, which was all that was required and, for the first time in a very long time, all that he wanted.